Welcome back to Think Design Work Smart. I'm Alex Bolboaca and I'm coming at you from the Mozaic Works studios, and what I have for you today is a reaction and a discussion on a list of books for software architects. We will discuss from a list of books published by Gregor Hope, Hohpe, and I'm gonna show you in a minute what this is about. I thought this is an interesting topic to discuss since I often work with software architects and or with people who want to become software architects. The problem with software architecture is not so much that there are no books, the problem is there are a lot of books. So I hope here we will start a conversation around some of the most important books for software architecture, the one that you should really read. And because of this, I will start with the list that Gregor Hope published on books that are old, because I think these are too often neglected by developers. We often think in this industry that old books, that everything is new and that old books don't have value, and that is patently incorrect. We are just working in cycles basically in this industry. So let's see what Gregor Hope has to say. So first of all, about him, the website is The Architect Elevator, and Gregor Hope presentation was: I help enterprises with their architecture strategy and cloud transformation journey by connecting the penthouse with the engine room. Ex-Google, Allianz, ThoughtWorks, Deloitte. So pretty good CV, I would say. This was published and updated on June 22nd, 2024. So a few days ago. I'm recording this in advance for the summer, so you'll probably see it sometime in July or August, but I'm recording this in June. Reading technical books is finally on the upswing again, and so are book lists. I haven't seen that, but okay. I have published my own bookshelf, and we'll go and see this. Some 3 years ago, looking back on the shelf, I noticed that some books are more than 20 years old, with others like Design Patterns steadily inching up to the 30-year mark. In a software world where we believe that we invented everything just last year, for many buzzwords that might be true, but only buzzwords because the concepts are the same. I decided to make a list of all the Ctrl-H, that means delete, classic books that I believe every architect should read. The oldest book, 20 BC, De Architectura, written by Vitruvius. This is the seminal book for architecture. It basically introduces what architecture means and how architecture works and the characteristics of good architecture. And yeah, it talks about the qualities of good architecture, firmitas, I don't remember all of them. So yeah, it's not the easiest book to read because the style was very different back then, and I don't think it's that important for software architects, but it's still a book that is that would be useful. 1975, The Mythical Man Month. Yeah. So this classic by Fred Brooks is the source of the famous insight that adding manpower to a lay software project makes it later, which is something most project managers today haven't learned yet, and it's impressive. Even the anniversary edition is now 30 years old, so you have little excuse for not having read it. I love this book. I have read this a long time ago. I think I've read it twice. Uh, I think I should reread it because honestly, it's a classic, and some of the things in it are still valid, which is impressive. Some of the things are a bit outdated in the sense that I've recently seen an analysis on the book. Frederick Brooks was talking about an organizational model that he called the surgical team, where you would have senior or experienced programmer who would be kind of like the surgeon, and the surgeon would have around a group of people who help, and some of those would be junior programmers, but he also mentioned the secretary and so on. So imagine how it would be if you'd organize a team like that. And the thing is, what happened is that many things got automated. Like at the time when Fred Brooks was building software, at least the one that described in this book, they were working with mainframes. The programming model is very different. So yeah, things have changed. A lot more things have automated, and basically many of the roles that were in the surgical team have moved into automation. Because now we have compilers, we have various tools, we have continuous deployment, we have all these things that you can use, and that count as this surgical team, but not only for the senior developer, but also for the rest of the team. But still, there are some intriguing ideas there, like have a person in the team that is responsible for tools that help developers. Maybe not a person in every team, but it would be amazing to have this and to actually build tools. And this comes, there's the approach that we discussed about building tools around in your environment that are adapted to your code base. I don't remember right now the name of this practice, but it's something that's on the grow, and we did an interview on that. It's pretty interesting. I will add the mention in the details. 1977, A Pattern Language by Christopher Alexander. Yeah. So I mentioned this book a number of times when I discussed design patterns. What many people don't realize is that design patterns are not, the source of design patterns is not the software development community. It's Christopher Alexander, who was an architect and a city planner, you'd call today. And basically what he wanted to do is to look at the history of architecture and bring together what is called the pattern language. So pattern language is a set of design patterns that together would create a pleasant environment to live in. And for example, one of the patterns would be have a window in each room so that you have light, you have natural light, and things like that. And he was very, very brave, I'd say, very ambitious, trying to get this not only to be a pattern language, but to be a generative language, which means if you use these patterns together, what you'll end up is it will generate for you a building that works as a nice place to live. And I am fascinated by this because this is very meta. It's very difficult to understand even for architects today, like building architects. It has caught on more or less in city planning because you have patterns there and you're talking about systems, not only about small things. And it has caught on in the software development community because a few people read this book and they thought, oh, that's interesting. How about we try to apply this to software development? And this happened at the point where object-oriented programming was on the rise. And when they were trying to figure out how to structure object-oriented code immediately after the software crisis. So the software crisis was around the 70s when programs grew too big to be managed in the old style, in the structure style. And this idea of objects came up and kind of morphed and transformed and then merged with design patterns. But design patterns, while being initially connected with object-oriented, they are not necessarily in relationship with objects. They can be in relationship with any design element. So in functional programming, you'd use the functional building blocks, like monad is a design pattern that is specific to functional programming. So there are these interesting things happening. So the book isn't just a collection of patterns, but a language composed of patterns. Something that many modern technology pattern books don't get right. And the initial design patterns book tried to get this right without saying that we'll get to the generative level. They said we didn't get to obtain the generative language. But we did create a language, a pattern language. So it's a pattern language in the sense that each design pattern is seen like a concept that you use, and then where you use it is kind of the verb. So you can use, you can build phrases using this language. It's a fascinating thing, and design patterns movement continues to this day without many people knowing. It's called pattern language of programming, or pattern language of, yeah, I think pattern language of programming, PLOP, P-L-O-P. If you search for it, there will be a conference soon. There's a conference every year in US, and I think one every year in Europe. And then there are some more around the world. All right. Very interesting. 1978, Data in Reality. I don't know about this book, but based on the description, it sounds very interesting. This great title from 1978, the original RX-7 with a 100 HP rotary engine, long that year. Okay. He's dating with cars, I think. Tackles the topic of modeling data, reminding us right from the start that data isn't the reality, with one of my favorite quotes. Highways are not painted red and rivers do not have county lines run down the middle. Yeah, the map is not the territory, remember that. The key point here is that the purpose of modeling isn't to represent reality, but to represent a useful interpretation of that reality. I feel like many people have gotten that wrong. Like we're talking about domain-driven design. Or initially it was objects. Objects are better because they represent reality. No, objects shouldn't represent reality. When you do object-oriented design, objects should represent a useful interpretation of that reality. Domain-driven design, similar thing. When you do domain modeling, you are not trying to represent reality. And this is why we are actually extracting domain the domain model from experts who have built in time their language. So the language that experts use has evolved, and we kind of try to pick out of that because it's already refined. So we can use those words, but then it turns out that they also adapt when they go into software systems. Which is why basically what you're doing, by the way, is something that's from linguistics and not technical. You're building a jargon. You're building a jargon. And I find it really funny when people tell me that no, programming and architecture are very technical. Yeah, they are technical, of course. Everything needs to run on a computer in the end. But what you are doing in order to get there is fundamentally humanistic, in this case linguistics. Following George Box's mantra that all models are wrong, some are useful, we should not try to make the model right, but rather to make it useful. Coloring highways different from regular roads is useful, although it is wrong. The book is now in its third edition from 2012. Okay, data and reality, interesting. 1996, software architecture. I haven't read this. Winding the clock almost 2 decades forward, will arrive at the first defining book on software architecture, Mary Shaw and Dave Garland's Software Architecture Perspective on an Emerging Discipline from 1996. We finally got the answer when at a certain event in 2015, Mary told us that if they had been more familiar with the design patterns movement when they wrote the book, they would have likely called the styles patterns. Their book derives from a paper from January 1994, roughly half a year before Design Patterns was published. Okay. The book's key elements that stand out and are most often cited are A. The positioning of software architecture as the evolution from high-level programming language and abstract data types, and B. A catalog of common architectural styles. It's a relatively skinny book, so it's more than what the 0 to 63 inches that it'll take up on your physical bookshelf. What stands out to me even more than the book is Mary's keynote from Saturn's 2015 on software engineering in Baltimore. You can watch the video recording. Oh boy. From the Amazon reviews to snippets aptly capture the book as a valuable time capsule. Great for telling your clueless boss what architecture is. If you are looking for the cutting edge software architecture principle, that this is definitely not the book for you. Yeah, so this probably defines the principle. I'm curious about the architectural styles. When we talk about, generally when I think about architectural styles, I think about monolith and distributed, which are the two big ones. And then inside monolith, you have a bunch of possibilities. Like you can have hexagonal architecture, you can have or ports and adapters, clean architecture, and so on. But those weren't a thing back then, I think. So that's interesting. Maybe I'll watch the video. 1990. Are your lights on? The 1990s blessed us with a group of prolific and insightful authors like Fred Brooks, Larry Constantine, Tom DeMarco, Gerald Weinberg, Ed Jordan, and many others. These books took a critically important broader view of the context in which software architects operate, such as understanding problems, communicating with stakeholders, structuring project teams. One of favorites is Are Your Lights On by Gerald Weinberg, perhaps tied with his earlier title, The Secrets of Consulting. Both books are entertaining and insightful. Gerald Weinberg was amazing. His books are great. Yeah. And Larry Constantine, Tom DeMarco, these are definitely authors you should look for. 2006 Enterprise Architecture Strategy. If we saw one of the first defining books on software architecture in 1996, Enterprise Architecture made its stage debut 10 years later, with John Ross, Peter Wills, and David Robertson, Enterprise Architecture Strategy. We find that the field of enterprise architecture is a mere 18 years old, which might explain the many debates around its exact scope, purpose, and relationship to business architecture, the latter appearing to be the most contentious or at least most vocal one. The most cited artifact from the book is a metric showing the relationship between a business model and architectural choices. For example, a replicated business model, hotel chain McDonald's, places more emphasis on a common application framework platform, whereas a diverse business necessitates integration across diverse systems. Okay, that's interesting. Haven't read this one, and honestly, I'm not such a big believer in enterprise architecture. I think that a lot of the things around enterprise architecture are fundamentally systems. So it's systems thinking applied to architecture. And if you have those two, you basically have what you need. And it's kind of the same for architecture, which is kind of systems thinking applied to software design. So, but yeah, I have to be careful with its terms because I mean them in a very specific way. For me, software design is in the extreme programming definition, which is the structure of the code and how the code is structured, so such that it emphasizes certain desirable characteristics. For example, changeability is the most common one, but it can also be performance, it can be interoperability, a bunch of other things. So when you go one level up, you apply systems thinking to design, and you end up with architecture. You apply systems thinking to a bunch of different architectures, you end up with enterprise architecture. 2002, The Design of Everyday Things. Yes, this is an amazing book. I wish more people who are writing code and who are building architectures would read general design books. This is one of the best general design books. It talks about, it basically introduced usability. That's what this book is about. And UX. Donald Norman is, again, a genius. And his latest book on emotional design is very insightful, once again. And yeah, maybe it sounds weird to say that emotional design should be part of software development, but yes, I believe it should. This book is one of my inspirations for usable software design, and so for applying usability principles to the way we structure code, which is, you would call today more or less developer experience, but I think it's more than that. It's a more structured approach than what they are trying to do with developer experience. So these are the old books, and I would like to add to these two. One is Universal Principles of Design. This is a book that inspired me. I studied it. It's a very nice one. It's a book about general design principles. And then I found it incredibly useful to think about these design principles in the context of software design and software architecture. And some of them don't apply, but some of them apply in unexpected ways, right? For example, there's one principle, which is the white space, leave white space. And it took me a while to realize how this can apply to software design. But honestly, white space is about removing things in order to emphasize what's left. And so in the process of design, one thing we can do is to remove things. And by removing things, we can emphasize what's left. What can we remove? We can remove comments and replace them with better names, for example. By the way, I don't mean remove all comments. Remove comments, replace them with better names. This emphasizes the names because we remove the comments. So it's a very deep principle that applies in a very unexpected way, because software design is a bit more, it happens in your mind compared with the design of things like this one. And the other one, which is incredible book, is called Design Creation of Artifacts in Society. It's written by Carl T. Ulrich, University of Pennsylvania. And it's a Creative Commons license book. So you can basically find it on ulrichbook.org and download it. It's for free. And it's a very interesting exploration of the design process, the general design process as applied to all the possible design, a lot of the possible design disciplines. And he comes up with something that's very, very interesting, this design process. You sense a gap, you define a problem, you explore alternatives, you select a plan, implement the plan. This is the basic design process. And then what's very, very interesting is that you can use test-driven development to explore alternatives here, which is something I feel we are not doing enough in software development. We kind of find the first thing that works and then go with that. But if you use test-driven development together with a set of constraints, and you change the constraints that you use, for example, one constraint would be only 2-line methods, maximum methods of 2 lines long. Another constraint would be everything is immutable. Another constraint could be, what else can we use? No conditionals, no loops. If you are doing that, you will see that you have different alternatives for how to structure your code. To me, that's fascinating. Not many people do this enough from my point of view. Okay. And now let's go into the blog post that he published actually before this, 17 November 2020, updated, with a list of books. I'm just gonna go through them fairly quickly. Clean code, refactoring design patterns, pattern-oriented software architecture. All of these are very important, and yeah, you should know them. Connected components, building microservices, the book that people have not read and then started doing microservice architecture and then got into trouble. Fundamentals of Software Architecture, very good book on. It emphasizes the trade-offs and everything that's around software architecture and how software architecture is different from software design. Enterprise integration patterns and pattern-oriented software architecture. This is volume 4, I think. Yeah. And the previous one is volume 1. Enterprise integration patterns has not changed much. Still relevant 17 years after publication, okay, minus the funny MSMQ examples in Java 1.4. Of course, so this is basically patterns of integration, so it talks about things like message queues or integration through the database, or all the different patterns. Very interesting. Entire systems. Just enough software architecture, software systems architecture, thinking in systems, the model thinker. I actually don't know these, and okay, it's gonna be interesting. Shelf for context, technology strategy patterns, the Phoenix Project, very interesting books. This book introduced continuous integration, I think. The software architect elevator, all the other stuff. It's interesting. All the other stuff. And then first derivative. We find that our model is missing an important dimension, time. Managing change, continuous delivery, yeah. Accelerate building evolutionary architectures. Yeah, we're not thinking enough in terms of evolution. And evolutionary architecture is system thinking applied to software architecture only on the time coordinate. Yeah, so these are all very interesting. And he is mentioning that there are a few books missing. Software Architecture for Developers by Simon Brown. Yeah, this is a very good book that helps developers understand what's happening with software architecture. And Mike Nigard's Release It, which is, again, very interesting book. Right. So these are some of the books that that Gregor Hope is recommending, and I've also added a couple of books that I'm recommending. It's very hard to recommend books on software architecture, but I think this is a good list. And I wanted to go through it because, as I said, the problem with software architecture is not that there are not enough resources, is that you get very quickly overwhelmed by the number of resources. And by the way, to help you transition, we have a learning program from developer to architect. If you're a developer thinking of becoming a software architect, that's a good place to start, because we discuss the elements of this book. And in case you are an architect that realizes that needs more structure, because often what happens, developers are promoted to be architects, they believe it's kind of the same job, they realize that it's not the same job, struggle with it, and then after a few years they realize, oops, now maybe we have a need for structure. And when this happens, we have another very good learning program that helps you deal with this and get more structure. Okay. So what do you think about this list? Have you read these books? Are there any other books that you'd like to recommend? Tell other people who are watching this and who are reading the comments. We love comments, and if you post other lists of books, if you ask us questions, like things that are missing, one of the perks of this channel is that your question might become a video, the answer to your question. That's it from me for now. Thank you kindly for the view, and until next time, remember to think, design, and work smart. See you next Saturday.